is Stan Kuruvilla, who has done a JD in law and is a product marketing leader. And so, Stan, can you tell us how did studying law help you succeed in the tech industry?
Sure, that's a great question. It's kind of an indirect way into what some of the things that I do now. But studying law, what you end up doing in law school is a lot of research, right? What might be traditionally considered research and writing. I was part of a law review program, which is basically um, publishing journal articles, right, that professors have written, other legal scholars have written, and then reading cases, a lot of cases, um, because that's sort of how you study law, is you study the history of cases in a particular area or in a particular field. And so that naturally exposes you to a lot of reading and a lot of writing, and then all of the kind of the technical aspects of that discipline, right? And so that is one bucket of skills that I found that could be transferable to almost anything. And then beyond that, one of the reasons you're studying these skills and studying cases and the history of specific areas is so that you can be a better advocate for the client who's looking for some form of outcome, right? And so you're also learning that. So advocacy becomes another, I guess, a composite skill set out of this. So those two things are probably the most valuable that I've found transferable from law to some of what I do today. So in product marketing, both advocacy, writing, and written and oral communications are very, very important. And so much of what I do involves that, and doing that in a business framework that inside of a company that helps to promote the company brand, the company marketing, and then ultimately advocating for the position of what we are selling, right? So that's how I use those skill sets today. There's also some of the techniques of persuasion, which would probably fall under advocacy. Techniques of persuasion. So some names that are more on the business side are everything from Dale Carnegie, right? How to Win Friends and Influence Others. Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And there's another book called Influence. It's called, I think it's Robert Cialdini. So these are some of the more business-oriented things that are around this persuasive techniques, right? So whereas in law and in a courtroom or in a brief, you might have more traditional, more formal techniques of persuasion. You have very different techniques of persuasion in the field of business. And so, learning some of these things simply is taking those transferable skills and applying them in a way that helps, advance your craft, right? So that's what I've found in terms of helping me take my law skills, my core law skills, and applying that in the business setting. So these things occurred almost naturally to me as I was looking at it and saying, oh, this is essentially the same thing, but with a different skin on it, right? And so that's what it is. And then, of course, there's other benefits. The real reason I went into law is because there was a connection in how between coding and the product of coding and how you monetize, right? And that how you monetize your software. So Bill Gates, when he started in the 70s, was writing code for computers, which nobody had quite figured out how to get people to pay for it, right? And so from that point onwards, there was a foundation laid of how to monetize software, because previously it had not been done. And so software itself fundamentally is either open source or closed source, and depending on what type of software it is, there are various ways to monetize it, through licensing. Like we routinely accept licenses when we use software today, right? We just kind of click through very quickly, but there's a bunch of terms there that we're accepting. Exactly. And those terms help to form the contract that you're essentially signing with the software company. And so those layers are what you get exposed to in law. And so that was my original interest, was how do you take software that you've written? Anybody can write software, right? But then how do you take that and transition that to the licensing required, the intellectual property protection required? And so in closed source environments, so Microsoft, as an example, has always been a closed source environment as opposed to Linux. Linux is an open source environment where you can look at the code, you can copy the code, you can do all those things, right? So there are techniques in law that help you protect and monetize closed source, and then there are techniques in law that help you monetize open source, right? So these are not in the coding world, these are more in the law world, in the sense that they are licensing, commercial terms, right? And intellectual property protection. So those were the original interests. And those are, I would say, almost like a third bucket of skill sets that are transferable from the law into the technology side. So understanding these things at a deep level helps me kind of frame things when I'm working for software companies doing these other things. And I guess a practical example of that is if you were to look at anyone from Apple all the way to Oracle, they stand on some core elements that have come from the open source world. One is called FreeBSD, which has its own licensing terms. But over the 90s and the early 2000s, Steve Jobs absorbed many of those coding elements, right? Those foundational components into what we take for granted and we don't even think about. Things like iOS, Mac OS, all those things. Similarly, on the Oracle side, Oracle was always in the proprietary Unix world, but increasingly has an open source strategy that helps them make money in a world where you can look at the source code, right? So understanding the nuance of the law and the commercial terms and licensing and the models helps you understand how you convert that into a way you can monetize. You're delivering value to the customer, and how do you monetize that, right? And so that gives you another perspective when you're working inside of these companies.
Great.